She's the one who keeps rejecting you? Torben asked. They were standing on the ridge above Brindlecross. The village spread below them in a patchwork of stone roofs and chimney smoke and cart-rutted lanes. The morning was cool, early enough that mist still clung to the river, and the only sound that carried this far up was the distant ring of a hammer on iron. Steady, rhythmic, relentless. Merrick Drummond, Alpha King of the Western Provinces, sovereign of 4 territories, commander of the largest standing army north of the Ashenmere, was watching the thin column of smoke rising from the forge at the village's eastern edge. And he was smiling. Not the diplomatic smile Torben had seen deployed in 100 council chambers, but something raw and real and faintly idiotic. The smile of a man who had everything the world could offer and had discovered, 3 weeks ago, that none of it compared to being told no by a woman with soot on her face. Every single day, Merrick said. Torben rubbed the back of his neck. He'd served the king for 8 years. Through border disputes, council standoffs, one attempted coup that lasted exactly 14 minutes before Merrick ended it by walking into the room and sitting down. He had never seen the Alpha King grin about being told no. He'd also never seen him ride 3 hours from the nearest garrison every morning, refuse a military escort, and carry exact change in his jacket pocket like a common customer. 22 times. 22. Torben let that sit. And you're just going to keep asking. Until she's ready to say yes. Or until she tells me to actually stop. Not the way she says it now. What's the difference? Merrick looked at him. The grin softened into something quieter. Something Torben had never seen on his king's face. She smiles when she says it. Just barely. Just at the corner. But it's there. Torben followed his gaze to the forge smoke. Below, a figure moved across the stable yard, ginger-haired, purposeful. And the bond? Every time I get close, her forge fire jumps. Flames lean toward me. Embers brighten. She pretends not to notice. He paused. I pretend not to notice her pretending. Torben opened his mouth to respond, but a sound cut through the morning air that turned both their heads. A howl, long and low, rolling across the hills from the northeast. Then another, closer. Then a third, overlapping the second, and the mist over the river seemed to thicken. Merrick's smile vanished. That's not a lone wolf, Torben said. No, that's a pack. The king was already moving, his hand on the hilt at his belt, his eyes scanning the tree line. And they're moving toward the village. What Torben didn't know, what Merrick had told no one, was how it had started. 22 days ago, he had ridden into Brindlecross on a lame horse. Not staged, not orchestrated. Genuinely lame, a stone bruise from the mountain road. The nearest farrier was in the village at the eastern end of the valley. A stone forge, a stable yard. A woman he'd never met. She'd had a nail clenched between her teeth and stood up to her elbows when he'd stepped into the doorway, and she hadn't looked up. Hadn't registered the quality of his horse, the cut of his jacket, the sword at his hip. She'd said, "You found her," like it was obvious, like she was the only smith in the world and he was simply late. He'd asked for same-day service. She'd told him Thursday. He'd asked her to dinner. She'd said no with a nail between her teeth and gone back to work. And the fire in her forge had surged. A sudden, violent leap of flame that she'd ignored and he had not. He'd known, in that instant, what it meant. The Ember Bond. He'd read about it in the old records, heard it described by his grandmother before she passed. The way a fire responds to the proximity of a matched pair. The way heat recognizes heat. He'd spent 4 years waiting for it. He'd stopped believing it would come. And it had come in a forge in Brindlecross, from a woman who charged him the stranger's rate and didn't bother to learn his name. He'd come back Thursday, and Friday, And every morning since, 3 hours each way from the garrison, alone, carrying exact change, because the moment he'd walked into her forge, the entire architecture of his life had rearranged itself around a single, unshakable fact. She was the one, and she was going to need time. 22 mornings, 22 refusals, 22 rides home with the same grin on his face. Because every no she gave him was proof of what he already knew. She felt it too. You don't spend that much energy refusing something that doesn't matter. By mid-morning, the word had spread through Brindlecross like a brush fire. Wolves, a full pack, driven down from the northern ridge by something: drought, territory loss, starvation. The shepherds had found 3 sheep torn apart at dawn, and the tracks led straight down the hill toward the village, not skirting the edges, heading for the center. Merrick had sent Torben to the garrison for reinforcements, but the roads were muddy from last week's rain, and the nearest company was a half-day's ride. By noon, the village elder, a wiry man named Pell, who had survived enough winters to know when to be cautious, had ordered everyone to gather at the inn, the sturdiest building in Brindlecross. Board the windows, bar the doors. Keep the livestock in the stone barn behind the market square. Everyone was moving. Everyone was listening. Except one. Merrick found Cressida Hale exactly where he expected to find her. In her forge, hammer in hand, fire burning, working as though the entire village hadn't just been told to evacuate. The forge sat at the edge of Brindlecross like a sentinel. Stone walls, heavy timber roof, a chimney that had been rebuilt twice and would outlast the woman who tended it. The stable yard beside it held 3 horses that weren't hers, 2 that were, and a stack of ironwood that she'd bought, reluctantly, grudgingly, from a supplier whose delivery had conveniently coincided with a gift she'd refused from a certain king 2 weeks ago. She didn't think about that. She thought about the fire, and the iron, and the 26 things on her work schedule that wolves were not going to rearrange. "You heard the order?" Merrick said from the doorway. She didn't look up. She was shaping a hinge on the anvil, the rhythm of her strikes steady and precise. Her ginger auburn hair was knotted loosely at her nape, loose strands sticking to her temples with sweat. Her canvas apron was streaked with soot over a clay-red tunic, and her dove-gray eyes, when they finally flicked to his, held exactly 0 intention of cooperating. "I heard it. And my forge doesn't move, Merrick. The furnace, the bellows, the anvil, the stock, none of it walks to the inn on command. If the wolves get in here, they'll destroy everything. A season's worth of ironwood, tools I spent years collecting. The furnace lining alone took me 3 months to set properly." She drove a nail with a single, decisive strike. "I'm not leaving. I know what a forge is worth. I also know what you're worth, and don't." The word came out sharp enough to cut. She set the hammer down and faced him. "Don't tell me what I'm worth. Every man who's ever tried to make a decision for me started with that sentence." The words landed between them, and she watched him absorb them, watched the easy response die on his lips, watched him recalibrate. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He stood in her doorway and looked at her with those warm umber eyes that had been looking at her the same way for 3 weeks, and he nodded. "You're right. I'm sorry." He stepped inside, closed the heavy door behind him. The sounds of the village, cartwheels, raised voices, the bleating of herded sheep, vanished. "You're not leaving, so I'm staying." "You're the Alpha King. You should be at the inn coordinating." "Torben is coordinating. That's what betas are for." He leaned against the wall. The forge fire, as if on cue, surged. Flames climbing, embers brightening, the whole furnace leaning toward him like a living thing greeting its other half. She saw it. He saw her see it. Neither of them mentioned it. "Fine," she said. "Stay. But if you're in my forge, you work. Tell me what to do." She handed him a pair of heavy tongs and pointed at the iron bar stock along the wall. "We're going to reinforce the shutters and the door. I'll shape the brackets. You hold what I tell you to hold and stay out of my way." "Yes, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am." "Yes, Cressida." The way he said her name, unhurried, weighted, like something precious he was carrying with both hands, made the ember in her chest flare so hard she had to grip the anvil. She turned back to the fire and pretended it was the heat making her flush. They worked through the afternoon. Merrick was stronger than she'd expected. She'd seen the breadth of his shoulders, obviously. She wasn't blind. But there was a difference between looking strong and actually being useful in a forge. He held the iron steady while she hammered, adjusted his grip when she told him without arguing, and carried the finished brackets to the windows with a quiet efficiency that told her he'd done physical labor before. Not forge work, but something. Soldiering, probably. The kind of work that taught your body to be a tool before it was a comfort. She'd braced herself for conversation, for the charm offensive, the 23rd attempt at dinner, the slow erosion of her defenses that she'd come to expect from his daily visits. Instead, he said nothing. He watched her work. He handed her tools before she asked for them. The right tools, in the right order, because he'd been paying attention for 3 weeks, and apparently that extended to memorizing the layout of her workspace. It was the silence that undid her. She was used to men who filled every pause with themselves. Their opinions, their stories, their need to be seen and heard and acknowledged. Merrick filled the pause with presence. He was simply there, solid and warm and attentive, the way the forge wall was there, the way the anvil was there. Not demanding anything, just holding the space steady while she worked. The forge fire, meanwhile, had lost all pretense of normalcy. It burned hotter and more evenly than any fire she'd ever tended, the flames holding a steady orange gold that should have required constant bellows work and didn't. Every time Merrick passed behind her, close but never touching, the coals brightened. Every time their hands brushed exchanging a tool, sparks jumped from the contact point, tiny constellations that scattered across the stone floor and died in the dust. By the 5th bracket, she stopped pretending not to notice. "The fire does that because of you," she said, not looking at him. She was holding a bracket against the shutter frame, marking the holes for nails. "It started 3 weeks ago, the first time you walked in." He was quiet for a moment. "I know." "What is it?" "The bond. Ember manifestation. It's rare. The fire recognizes something between us that we haven't acknowledged yet." He paused, chose his next words like a man choosing where to place his feet on a narrow ledge. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't there, but I'm also not going to use it as leverage. What the fire does is the fire's business. What you do is yours." She drove a nail into the bracket, then another, then a third, each strike harder than the last. "That's the most annoying thing anyone has ever said to me," she muttered. "More annoying than same time tomorrow?" She didn't answer, but the corner of her mouth twitched, and behind her the fire climbed another inch. By late afternoon the shutters were reinforced, and the door had a new crossbar. Cressida wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and surveyed the work. "Not bad," she said, "for a king. High praise from the woman who charged me double on day 2. She almost smiled. Almost. "You could afford it." Outside, the light was changing. The sky going from pale gray to the bruised amber of early evening. The sounds of the village had gone quiet. Everyone was inside. Doors barred, shutters drawn, children pulled onto laps and told to be still. Brindlecross held its breath, and the silence that settled over the rooftops was the worst kind, the kind that waits. And beyond the quiet, at the edges of hearing, something else. Not howling now. Movement. A low, constant presence in the hills. The rustle of bodies through undergrowth, the crack of a branch, the occasional yip that was answered immediately by another. The pack was circling, tightening its orbit, testing the perimeter of the village the way a hand tests the edge of a blade. Merrick moved to the window and looked through the gap between the reinforced shutters. His face, in the fading light, had changed. The easy patience replaced by something harder, more focused. The suitor was gone. This was the king. The man who had ended a coup in 14 minutes. "They're in the tree line," he said. "Northeast edge. I can see movement. 4, maybe 5. Cressida joined him at the window. She could see it too. Shapes between the trunks, low and dark, pacing. Not attacking. Testing. Figuring out where the gaps were. Where the fences were weakest. Where the scent of livestock was strongest. "They won't come in while the fire's burning," she said. "Wolves avoid flame." "Then we keep the fire burning." Their eyes met in the dim space between the shutters. He was close, closer than he'd ever been in her forge, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his warm umber eyes, close enough that the ember in her chest wasn't pulsing anymore. It was humming, a low, constant vibration, like a string plucked and refused to stop resonating. "You should eat something," she said, and stepped back before the humming became something she couldn't ignore. She kept a supply shelf in the back of the forge. Dried meat, hard cheese, a jar of pickled root vegetables, a loaf of bread she'd bought that morning from the baker's boy. They ate sitting on the floor with their backs against the stone wall, the forge fire throwing long shadows, the warmth pressing against their faces. The wolves were quiet now. No howling, no snarling. Just the occasional scrape of movement in the dark, waiting. "Can I ask you something?" Merrick said. "You're going to whether I say yes or not." He smiled. "Why 22 times?" She set down the bread. "What?" 22 rejections. You could have told me to stop on day 1. Really stop, not the way you say it. You could have said go away and never come back, and I would have gone. You didn't." He looked at her. "Why?" The question sat between them, heavy and honest. The forge fire crackled, and somewhere in the walls a timber shifted, settling. "Because you paid exact change," she said quietly. He blinked. "What?" "The first day. 12 coppers per horse. You counted them out exactly. No tip. No extra. No gold coin tossed on the anvil to show me what you could afford." She stared at the fire. "Every man with power I've ever known uses money as a lever. You used it as respect. Like my price was my price, and you honored it. Your price was fair. My price was high. I charged you the stranger's rate. I was a stranger. You were a king pretending to be a stranger. There's a difference. Most men in your position would have told me who they were and expected the work for free. You stood in my yard for 4 hours and said thank you when I finished." She paused. "That's why I didn't tell you to stop. Because every day you came back, you were exactly the same person as the day before. No mask, no performance. Just you." He was quiet for a long time. The fire spoke in the silence. A low, steady hum that she'd stopped pretending was normal 3 weeks ago. "My father promised me to a lord's son when I was 16, she said. The words came out rough, scraped, dragged up from a place she kept locked. "He didn't tell me. I found out when the contracts were already signed. He wasn't cruel. That's the part people don't understand. He was kind. He thought the Lord's son would give me a better life than a forge could. He thought he was helping." She swallowed. "He signed my future away with a steady hand and a clear conscience, and he genuinely believed he was doing what was best." Outside, a wolf howled. Closer now, answered by 2 more. "That's worse than cruelty," she continued. "Cruelty you can fight. Kindness that doesn't see you, that just decides for you because it knows better. You can't fight that without becoming the villain in someone else's story." "You're not the villain," Merrick said. You were never the villain. I ran, walked 60 miles to the nearest town with a forge and no smith, built everything from nothing, and I swore that no man with power would ever decide my future again. She met his eyes. And then you walked into my doorway, and the fire jumped. And I knew instantly, that this was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to me. Not because you're a king. Because I wanted to say yes on day one, and that terrified me more than anything. Merrick didn't reach for her, didn't move. He sat with her words the way the forge sat with heat. Absorbing, holding, letting it settle into something the structure could bear. I am never going to decide your future, he said. I am going to ask you every single day if you want me in it. And you can say no every single time. And I will still be here. Because this isn't about what I can take, Cressida. It's about what you choose to give. She felt the old armor trying to close, the reflex that had kept her safe for 10 years. The one that turned every tender thing into a weapon and every open hand into a fist. It was so much easier to say no. No was a wall. No was a locked door. No was the 60 miles between her and the life someone else had chosen for her. Yes was an unbarred forge door with wolves outside. She looked at him. Soot on his shirt, firelight in his eyes, the copper ring catching the glow. He looked back, open, unguarded, more vulnerable than any king should allow himself to be. Merrick. Cressida. I'm glad you're here. It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a yes, but it was the first thing she'd said in 22 days that wasn't a no, and they both knew it. A crash. Both of them jolted. A heavy body against the stable-yard fence, wood splintering, then another, and another, and the low snarl of something large and hungry, testing the barrier between itself and the livestock pen. The horses inside screamed, kicking at their stalls with a desperate percussive panic that shook the walls. Merrick was on his feet instantly. Cressida was already reaching for the iron poker by the furnace, 3 feet of solid rod, glowing faintly orange at the tip where it had been resting near the coals. The heat of it pulsed in her grip, familiar and sure. Stay behind me, he said. This is my forge, my yard, my horses. She moved past him to the door, poker in hand, and looked back over her shoulder. You stay behind me. He looked at her, soot-streaked, fierce, her gray eyes bright with the reflected fire, holding a glowing iron rod like a weapon she'd been born to wield. And something broke open in his expression. Not fear, not frustration. Wonder. The kind a man shows when he realizes the thing he's been falling in love with is even more than he imagined. Together, then, he said. She unbarred the door. He pulled it open. The yard was silver and shadow in the moonlight. 3 wolves, massive, gaunt, ribs showing through matted fur, had broken through the fence and were circling the stable. They moved with a low, liquid coordination, testing the stable door, snapping at the hinges. The horses inside were frantic. Cressida didn't hesitate. She strode into the yard, planted her feet in the mud, and swung the poker in a wide arc. The glowing tip carved a trail of amber light through the dark, a line of fire drawn in the air itself. The nearest wolf flinched back, ears flat, lips peeled back in a snarl that died when the heat reached its face. Merrick moved beside her, not in front, beside. And together they advanced. She swept the light. He covered the gap with a forge hammer she hadn't even seen him grab. They moved like 2 parts of the same mechanism, wordless, instinctive, each one filling the space the other left open. The lead wolf lunged. Merrick stepped forward, swung the hammer into the dirt at its feet, not to hit, but to send a wall of mud and sparks into its face. The wolf scrambled sideways. Cressida drove the poker toward the second, the glow cutting the dark like a blade, and the heat was enough. The wolf yelped and fell back. The ember between them blazed. Not metaphorically. The forge behind them roared to life, fire climbing so high it threw light across the entire yard, turning the darkness to amber and gold. The shadows shrank. The wolves, caught between the glowing poker and the wall of firelight and two people who refused to give ground, broke. They scrambled through the shattered fence and disappeared into the tree line, and the yard went quiet except for the horse's ragged breathing and Cressida's pulse hammering in her ears. She turned to him. He was breathing hard, the hammer still raised, his blonde hair silver in the moonlight, his cream shirt dark with sweat and mud. His eyes found hers, and in the reflected glow of the forge fire, their fire, the one that answered to both of them, she saw everything he'd been holding back for 22 days. Not desire, though it was there. Not possession, though the bond hummed with it. Just the raw, unguarded truth of a man looking at the person he loved and realizing she was exactly who he thought she was. She kissed him, not gently, not carefully. She grabbed the front of his jacket with her free hand, the one that wasn't holding a glowing poker, and pulled him down and kissed him with 22 days of refusal burning in her throat. His free hand came to the side of her face, rough and trembling, smearing a line of mud across her jaw, and the ember between them didn't surge or flare or roar. It settled, like a fire that had been searching for its hearth and had finally found it. His mouth was warm and tasted like bread and wood smoke, and when she pulled back, just enough to breathe, the sound he made, low, broken, reverent, was the most honest sound she'd ever heard. "You kissed me," he said. "Don't let it go to your head." Too late. His forehead rested against hers. His thumb traced her cheekbone through the mud and soot. "Cressida. Merrick. I love you." His voice cracked on the word, and he didn't try to hide it. "I loved you at Thursday. I loved you at exact change. I love you now, standing in your yard with a forged poker and wolf tracks in the mud and absolutely no intention of letting anyone else fight your battles. I will love you tomorrow, whether you say yes or no, or nothing at all." She closed her eyes. The ember pulsed, steady, golden, permanent. The wolves were gone. The yard was quiet. And the man in front of her, the one who had asked 22 times and been refused 22 times and had never once, not once, tried to make the choice for her, was shaking because she'd kissed him. "I choose you," she whispered. "Not because the bond says so. Not because the fire jumps. Because you let me choose. Every single day. You never once tried to make the decision for me. And that is the bravest thing anyone has ever done. Not fighting the wolves. Not staying when I told you to leave, but standing in my doorway 22 mornings in a row and accepting no without it changing a single thing about how you looked at me." He pulled her closer, pressed his lips to her forehead gently, the way you hold something you've been given that you know you don't deserve and intend to spend the rest of your life earning. "Every single day," he said. Behind them, the forge burned on. Steady, tended, permanent. 3 months later, Cressida was elbow-deep in a horse's hoof. The forge was different now. Bigger, with a second furnace that Merrick had helped her build with his own hands, badly, with mortar that was uneven and bricks that didn't quite line up. Because he'd insisted on learning and she'd insisted on letting him fail, and they'd both ended up covered in dust and laughing so hard the apprentice came running, thinking someone was hurt. There was a door connecting the forge to the house next door. The house that had been empty for 6 years until a king decided that governing from a village was just as effective as governing from a palace, as long as the village had a forge, and the forge had Cressida in it. His advisors had been horrified. Torben had helped him move with a grin so wide it was nearly audible. The apprentice was a girl from the next village, 16, with quick hands and a stubborn streak that reminded Cressida of herself. She'd shown up muddy and defiant and said, "I heard the farrier in Brindlecross takes students." Cressida had looked at those calloused hands and seen herself 10 years ago, 60 miles away, asking for a chance. She'd handed the girl a pair of tongs before she'd finished her sentence. She was at the grinding wheel now, working a blade with a precision that made Cressida's chest ache with something that felt suspiciously like pride. The fence in the stable yard had been rebuilt, stronger, iron reinforced, with brackets Cressida had forged the night the wolves came. The brackets stayed even after the garrison secured the ridge, because they were good work, and because every time Merrick walked past them he touched the iron. Lightly, absently, the way you touch something that reminds you of the night your life changed. The villagers had stopped gossiping, not because there was nothing to talk about. A king living above a forge was by any measure extraordinary, but because the extraordinary had become ordinary. Merrick split wood in the mornings. Cressida shod horses in the afternoons. They argued about the proper way to bank a fire at least twice a week, and the arguments always ended the same way, with her proving she was right, and him conceding with that steady, warm umber grin that still, after 3 months, made the coals jump. Footsteps in the doorway. She knew the weight of them. "I'm looking for the smith," Merrick said. She didn't look up, couldn't hide the smile. "You found her." "I have a question." "I might have an answer." He crossed the forge, knelt in the soot and the iron filings and the hay, right there beside her, and took her free hand. The one that wasn't bracing a horse's hoof. His knees were in the ash. His jacket was already dusted gray from the morning's work, because he'd been in the forge since dawn, feeding the furnace, stacking stock, doing the heavy lifting she'd never asked him to do, and he'd never stopped doing. "Cressida Hale." "Merrick Drummond. Will you—" "Yes." He blinked. "I didn't finish." "You didn't need to." "I had a speech. I spent 3 days on it." "Was it good?" "Torben helped me write it." "Then definitely skip it." He laughed. The real laugh. The one that cracked the composure wide open and showed everything underneath. The boy who'd inherited a kingdom too young, the man who'd spent 6 years governing alone, the king who'd ridden 3 hours every morning to be told no by a woman with a hammer. She loved that laugh. She loved that she was the one who caused it. "Yes," she said again, because it was the best word she'd ever learned. "Yes, yes, yes." The apprentice dropped the blade she was grinding and clapped, and the forge fire, the one that had leapt for him since the first day, the one that had lit their way through a yard full of wolves, the one that answered to both of them now like it always had, blazed so high the chimney sang. He stood, and she let go of the horse's hoof, and he pulled her into his chest, his chin on her head, her hands fisted in the back of his jacket. The smell of smoke and chamois, and something underneath that was just him. "For the record," she said into his shirt, "I was always going to say yes." "I know. I just needed—" "I know." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. She felt him breathe her in. Smoke and iron and the lavender soap she used because it was the only softness she allowed herself. "I would have waited 22 more. 2,200, however long it took." "That's over 6 years, Merrick." "I did the math on about day 4. She laughed into his chest. "The speech really was terrible, wasn't it?" "You'll never know. Torben will be devastated." "Torben will survive. He's survived worse. He survived watching me ride 3 hours every morning for a woman who charged me double." Outside, Brindlecross went about its morning. Pella was hanging washing. The baker's boy was running between storefronts. Somewhere a horse stamped, waiting for shoes. And on the ridge where a beta had once watched his king stare at forge smoke and grin like a man undone, the grass bent in the wind and the light turned everything to gold. The fire's going out, she said. No, it's not. He was right. Behind